mountaintop is really where we move from, as I said earlier, the journey stage is about applying this thinking at your own organization. So really at the micro level, perhaps at the meso level. And the mountaintop is really where we talk about, okay, how do we scale this beyond into the kinds of influence where this type of thinking and practice is becomes commonplace at the meso level up to the macro level, where we're making actual systems change. That is the ultimate goal of everything that r3.0 does. And you notice I just said it right. So we're very pleased to have Floske Kusse from ING, who actually kicked off one of our early transformation journey programs, presenting us on the Terra approach, which we had just come out, and we were like, wow, this is amazing that it is so aligned with what we're doing, and it's not just operations at the company level, but also advocating for broader uptake. And also Stefan Bringezu from the UNEP International Resources Panel. So this results from a meeting that we had with Janas Potocnik, who is the chair of the International Resources Panel, where we were presenting the idea for the Global Thresholds and Allocations Council and seeking support for that. So he's going to speak on how the work that he does with the IRP really intersects with and supports the notion of thresholds and allocations, and particularly a council for that. So I just want to walk you through briefly, before we go into these presentations, why thresholds and allocations. We've been talking about it throughout, but this is really a sense of giving you an introduction to our Global Thresholds and Allocations Council, and it really starts with donuts, as we know from throughout the past 2 days, but also the notion of pies. So thresholds are expressed at a system level. In order to activate thresholds at a subsystem level, you have to slice the pie somehow, and that's where allocations come into play. So this is the well-known graphics of the planetary boundaries, and which create the ecological ceilings, and adding the social foundations to those. That's actually an idea that was first articulated in 1974 at a UNEP UNCTAD conference of the inner and outer limits. But it really took Kate's framing it as a mimetic image to get the donut to really take shape. The notion of allocations, this is applying it to water. So if you have water in a watershed, if this is all of the water that's there, you have to first recognize that nature has its own functions that need to be allocated first. And then you have the ability for humans to use that water. And then it's only after that that you can start having economic and social water allocations. And it's from that a specific facility might have an allocation of water. So the point here is that we have to fulfill the core human and planetary needs for water until we can start to allocate water to commercial, industrial usage. And then it's only a slice of that pie, if you will, that organizations can draw on. And that's just a baseline. I mean, it isn't like that is what you want. You would actually want to shrink it smaller than that to give us some resilience and some leaning in the system. This is just a snapshot of where we stand right now. So this was done in 2017 by Danish researchers, Anders Bjorn leading this up, where they looked at 40,000 corporate responsibility reports from 2000. Only 5% of them even mention ecological limits. So only 5% of them ever recognize that we live in a world of constraint when it comes to ecological resources. And then from there, only 31 of these 9,000 organizations that did this reporting, that translates into 0.3% are taking those ecological limits and expressing them, filtering them through their performance or product development. So it's as if these ecological limits don't exist if you were to look at corporate sustainability reports. So essentially, there's no corporate sustainability report that has actually reported on the sustainability performance of that organization. They've done bits and pieces, but this research shows. That's changing quickly, but we really need to make it go quicker. So this is a report that was released in 2015 at the Reporting 3.0 conference. I worked on a chapter in it on context. And the two things, one is that, well, you know, companies should apply a context-based approach. That's in some ways a no-brainer. But it's this one that really report r3.0 took up, is that multilateral organizations or others should collaborate to create a global governance body of scientists, academics, et cetera, to provide guidance on methodologies for determining ecological and social thresholds. And the social is just in parentheses because this is a UNEP report. And then give guidance on approaches for allocations that are applicable at the business level. So in other words, off the shelf. And what we translated this into is the Global Thresholds and Allocations Council. We've been incubating it for the last year and a half. This is the kickoff meeting where we were just testing the idea in beginning of 2018. This is the mission that we have for the GTAC. This is all available on our website, so I won't leave it up too long so that we can get to the speakers. But importantly, what we wanted to reveal in this conference is we sent out a letter of support, so as we're looking for funding for the Global Thresholds and Allocations to launch in a two-phase process with a 3-year timeline in order to establish itself, we sent it around to various different people in our network asking for signatures. And so we've come back with signatures from those who you can see here, including John Fullerton, who we've mentioned before, some folks who are here in the room, Keith Ambachir, our steering board member, and then these others. And this is open right now, so we have other signatures that are coming in as we speak. So I'd like to thank Kate Rayworth for adding her name to this, so the next time that we design this, it will have more names on it, and we welcome others to sign this. So keep tuned for the evolution of the Global Thresholds and Allocations Council. And we're going to use that as a way to introduce Stefan to come up and talk about the intersection of your work with IRP and the idea of thresholds and allocations. Oh, yes. There we go. Oh, right. Let me click through. Okay.
But before that, let's give him a hand, huh?
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Well, okay. Thank you, Bill and Ralph, for inviting me to this experience of your conference here. While being in the last session, it's a bit a challenge indeed. So what are we doing in our interfaculty center at the University of Kassel, Center for Environmental Systems Research? As you may conclude from the name, we are doing systems analysis of human environmental interactions and doing that at different scales in order to explore ways to sustainable futures. And with regard to the International Resource Panel, we have the privilege to be there on that panel since 2007. We have had recently a lively debate about science-based targets at our last meeting in Nairobi. And I can tell you, we have no consensus at all. There are those who say we need to have much more research before we can provide a valid recommendation for policy. And the panel always shall remain non-policy prescriptive. And there are others, and this is my faction, who say, well, we have always limited knowledge, but we can use the available knowledge in order to provide some orientation and guidance. And I will try to give you a short glimpse on that. So there are two key questions. What, with regard to sustainable use of global natural resources, what can be regarded as sustainable use of these resources on this planet, And second, how can knowledge on acceptable levels of that use be translated into management targets? You know about this. So we have heard this several times. So we have basic human needs which lead to minimum requirements of resource supply. And we have outer limit by planetary boundaries. Now we have several challenges. Challenge number one, these human needs expand. They are not constant, they are not confined, and the resource demands grow. And there are just two counteracting, trends. One is efficiency increase, so decoupling well-being from the use of resource on the one hand, and sufficiency, meaning what is enough for individuals, but also on a country basis. The point is that, for instance, why do human needs expand? Well, a refrigerator was deemed a luxury 100 years ago. Nowadays, it's deemed to be, say, a standard equipment for households. Second challenge, planetary boundaries. They are not fixed. They are social constructs. Also, the 2 degrees or 1 degrees Paris target, this is not defined by science. Science cannot define that. Science can model what will happen if we increase global temperature 1.5, 2, 3, or 5 degrees. But policy have decided what is the limit to the implications of global warming, which is acceptable or not. And with regard to biodiversity, at which level of the ongoing species loss shall we halt? Challenge 3. These planetary boundaries, as published by Stefan and et al., they are rather state targets. For instance, about the extension of global forests. But this is relatively far away from the actions, from management. We will not save the world forest by changing world forestry. The drivers are in agriculture and consumption production. And there we need to go with our orientation targets. And then the fourth challenge is not just about, say, scientific calculations, and it is about ethical and legal principles, about how much of that resource use, which we deem globally as acceptable, can be attributed to countries, to individuals, at times also with regard to climate burden sharing and so on. So the management targets in the end also will probably be allocated, attributed on a per person basis or per employee if you are going to build a bridge to industry and business. Now, purpose of science and knowledge-based targets, and I deliberately added science and knowledge-based targets because it's not just science-based, it's a wider basis of knowledge required. For governments, they have the interest to monitor the performance of the physical economy in an internationally comparable way. They want to check on progress towards the SDGs, and in the end, they need to change the regulatory, the incentive framework for the actors in production consumption if necessary. What about the business? For companies, they want to benchmark their performance in relation to national sectoral levels and should do that on a cradle-to-gate resource basis. And they could do that in relation to their turnover, value added, or the employees. And they could use these indicators, which are the basis for the targets, into existing environmental management schemes such as EMAS, just to be pragmatic, so to use the existing tools. Current trend, growing use of natural resources, as the reports of the International Resource Panel show. We are currently already beyond 90 billion tons per year of extraction of natural resources, and this is only the use part. The total movement is much higher. This is going to further production. And the business as usual indicates that we are going to calculate with a doubling of resource use extraction from 2017 to 2060, a doubling. We have conflicts already registered on resource extraction, refining of materials, on final disposal. This is a picture from the website of the Environmental Justice Atlas. These are all documented legal conflicts. And this is just a status quo. You nicely see that with the areas where we have severe or heavy mining activities in the Cordilleras there in southern America, there is a concentration of these conflicts, but also in other parts of the world. Now, it's not only about the bads, which we want to avoid, and the necessity, the needs of societies for food and energy and water supply. It's also the needs of the societal metabolism, which we shall have in mind for a long-term functioning of that metabolism. So there are four major points. The first is that the material demand should be largely supplied by recycling. We have heard that recycling has some limits, but in effect, there is no way then to trying to increase recycling and cascading use in technical terms as far as we can. And these cycles and cascades should be driven by energy flows supplied by renewable energies such as solar and wind. And there will be a remaining primary input from mining, agriculture, forestry, and there will be a remaining output of final disposal of waste and emissions. And these inflows and outflows remaining need to be kept in a safe operating space, meaning low risk. And fourth, which is a point which is currently largely overlooked, the anthropogenic stock, which is the houses and roads and the long-lived products, this stock is currently growing. More and more houses, more and more roads, more and more vehicles, and this physical growth phase cannot continue. It must come to an equilibrium, to a stabilization. We do not know the level. We know that in the eastern part of Germany, we have already shrinking cities next year, the coming years. In the whole of Germany, this equilibrium phase may be expected between 2040 and 2050. And in Western Europe, we are approaching saturation phase of living space as well as road length per person, etc. So this is not fiction. We are not so far away from that. Major scales. There are different scales. We have heard already from them. I pick out two basic scales. The micro scale, which is the farm level, the forest, the fishing ground, or the company. And the macro scale, national governments with NGOs and industry associations. So the region and the city would be in between. But just let us look to the micro and the macro level. In terms of land use, the challenge is that we need to manage every hectare, every square meter in the most sustainable way. But consider a situation that we had 100% organic farming of every agricultural hectare, and we would have still increasing demand for agricultural products. What would be the result? The whole tropical belt would be transformed into an agricultural area, 100% organic, but no savanna, no forest, no grasslands, I'm sorry. So this wouldn't be sustainable at a higher scale. So that means that we also need to control the demand for the numbers of hectares supplying biomass for food, fiber, and fuels. So which means that we need to have not only the farm, not only the micromanagement, but also the macro management. Now here, so somehow this seems to be the PDF. This is not the PowerPoint, right? Which is a bit too much of information, so stepwise. So the picture first. So here you see the production consumption system. You see the inputs of raw materials, abiotic, biotic, and the resulting emissions and waste. And the activities in production consumption determine that input and the throughput. And associated with the extraction and associated with the resulting outputs is a bundle of, pardon? No? Is a, my thick thumbs. is a bundle of impacts on the extraction and harvest side as well as on the output side. And if we want to reduce the environmental impact out there, we need to reduce that inflow and through flow here, which means that the management targets can aim to keep the use of the abiotic and biotic raw materials and the land use, water use, and energy use within safe limits. So the strategy is to reduce the magnitude of that primary resource use to make more welfare, well-being out of each unit extracted from nature. And for the fair attribution of the management targets, they can be related to the footprints of goods which are finally consumed in countries, or footprints, life cycle-wide, of products produced within companies on a product basis. So these are the two complementary tactics to work with that. And from a management macro point of view of global resource use, resource governments should then concentrate on the drivers in production and consumption to control the inputs and outputs and related impacts by headline indicators related to input and outputs by resource and climate footprints. And then we need not just to monitor and measure if we have so much climate warming emissions, then the question is it enough or is it acceptable? And the same for resource use. So we need these global references, science and knowledge-based targets, compare that, continue with the monitoring and adjust the policy measures in order to address the production and consumption system and the actors in industry and households. And we have to do that by with consideration of ethical and legal issues, so the attribution based on per person values. When we come to management targets, of course they need to be actionable, implementable, but they should then also be directionally safe. Directionally safe means they need to be not precise to picture every incident in the detail, but they need to lead to the right direction. There are first suggestions of possible targets for biotic resources regarding micromanagement and macromanagement. For agriculture, forestry, it means that shift towards sustainable cultivation. Every hectare. For fisheries, respect maximum quota for each species. And macromanagement could be related to the cropland associated with the supply for final demand, which should not exceed 0.20 hectare per person, in order to contribute halting the expansion of cropland, or with regard to forest, to consume not more what is regrowing in the forest, which could be on the world average or on what because we are in Europe and have a highly productive forest and a culture to use timber, could have also a continental target. And with regard to all these biotic, one could say the order of magnitudes of 2 tons per person primary biomass in 2050 could work as an orientation as well. When we come to the abiotic resources, and we are at the micromanagement, then it is mining. So the increase of share of responsible mining and quarrying could here be an indicator. But when it comes to the use of fossil fuels, we need to phase out coal and other fossil energy carriers, shift to renewable energy, shift to carbon recycling using CO2 as a raw material. And metals, construction minerals, industrial minerals, here we need to minimize the need for primary extraction and shift to recycling as far as it is ecologically sensible. And again, here we could apply a compound target in the order of magnitude of 6 to 12 tons per person primary extraction, oriented towards a return to the global extraction in the year 2000 or halving that level in 2050. My last slide is then related to the question which was put forward also this morning. What can we say to industry, to business? Because these are, say, government-oriented targets that I just shown you, or say micromanagement farm-oriented targets. Now, let us assume, or what we know is that in the European Union we have about 150 million employees in business. So about 1/3 of, say, the population. And if we assume that the relations of foreign trade and domestic consumption will remain unchanged in the coming decades, we could derive for greenhouse gas emissions from the consumption-based target 1 ton, a climate footprint target of 3 ton CO2 equivalents per employee in business in 2050. And if we adopt the raw material consumption as a pragmatic indicator, the raw material consumption measures the use extraction only, biotic and abiotic, and this was suggested for 2050 as an order of magnitude for orientation. And if we translate that into the business employees, that would mean 24 tons raw material input, material footprint per employee in business. So these are some orientation values which could be implemented in industries and could be integrated also in environmental schemes such as EMAS. If you consider the recent, or say the latest update of EMAS, so this was in 2017, then the requirements include consideration of the purchases of companies, including the upstream environmental burden, including materials and energy and water, etc. So in principle, it's all already written down, and we have the controlling instruments, the measurements, how to measure these footprints available. The challenge is just to implement that, to use that. And of course, we are in a process of societal learning. So what I just wanted to say here is that it's necessary and possible to provide industry and governments with targets, and that the footprint-based indicators and targets can be integrated into management schemes, and that we can learn from that by using these proxy targets and test them. And if we come to the conclusion that some of them need to be adapted, let's adapt them and learn from that. But as far as we know, this is what we can use. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we're going to have a seat at the couch here, and we're going to do a quick, because Stefan needs to leave, we're going to do a quick round of questions to him, and then do a round of questions to Floske afterwards. So if there are questions for Stefan, okay, great. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. Because you said that we have to come to a point that we use less material. But my question is, do you see a stabilization of humanity, so that we get to a point that we have maybe 10 billion people, and then there will be no more? So we get to a point that we don't need more resources? Because looking at that model that you showed, we will come to one point that we will not have the resources anymore to feed all humanity, so then we have to go to another planet. So where do you see that final output?
Short answer, so the stabilization of the world population is good, because at least that parameter is going to be controlled. But this will not lead to a stabilization of resource use in the coming decades. If you have a look at the Global Resources Outlook 2019, which is the latest report of the International Resource Panel, then you will see the modeling of the business as usual, and as I told you, a doubling until 2060, right? And this is a consequence of adoption of, say, Western technologies in the South, and also a rising middle class in the world, which is going to spend their money for what can be bought in the supermarkets and the shelves and in the automotive industry. So that's the challenge.
We've got another question up here. When Chris Dauma said that, we've gone from the top of Mount Everest and entered the celestial sphere after Nora Bateson's, and you've just taken it a step further into the next planet. So hopefully we don't need to go to a next planet. Yeah, next question,
Yeah,
please.
thank you for your presentation. It gives a good overview of the challenges we have from a resource efficiency perspective. It does, though, raise the question whether we move to a more communistic, centralized economic structure, because resources need to be redistributed, and who will own the redistribution and who will allocate that? How do you look at that aspect?
Well, that would be a separate talk. So the monitoring and the measurement is one thing, and the knowledge that we need to change production and consumption is the other thing. But how governments can change that, and how this is quite doable only by a mix of measures. And there are examples. So, for instance, so the German government, the Japanese government, the Austrian government, they have resource policy implemented, which try to promote things also in different fields of application, from the manufacturing to the housing sector, etc. To put it short, we need to combine energy efficiency with material efficiency. And we need to provide the engineers with the knowledge to do so. Currently, the curricula don't contain that. It will take time. So I'm in a faculty for civil engineering and environmental engineering. So my colleagues are still planning with lots of concrete.
One last question, Martina, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefan. Martina Prox, iPoint Systems. The question on the monitoring and how you link the micro and the meso and the macro level, because this is macro level numbers, and you showed this needs to go down to a per capita, and now you mentioned the engineers. So how do you see this connection of data, IT? Is there a vision that you can
we are working on practical tools also for engineers. So there is a paper in the journal Resources, which is online available by my colleague Clemens Mostert and myself, where we have provided characterization factors for the abiotic raw material input, which you can calculate life cycle wide. So this is a part of life cycle assessment, LCA, but dedicated to measure the footprint, so that it can be reduced. That also engineers in the future, when they design houses or machines or infrastructure or what else, can already in the computer see what the life cycle performance of their product, which they are going to design, will be, together with the climate footprint. Yeah, we need to combine the climate footprint, the resource footprint, and we can do that.
Okay, great. So we're going to move on. Thank you, Stefan.
I'm very sorry that I have to leave.
No, understood. I'm going to ask everyone to just close your eyes while I flip through Floske, back to Floske's. We just had a reordering at the last minute. So, it's being done up there. Okay, thank you. Nobody needs to close their eyes now.
Well, thanks for sticking around. That's for starters. I will be sharing something out of the practice of a bank, a mainstream commercial bank, ING, tapping into science, data, methodologies, and what have you, but I also be sharing about the other side of the coin, so to say, the change that is needed in approach, in mindset, within a company that is so risk-based, right? Bankers are, in essence, risk managers. They are looking for opportunities, but when faced with new developments, the first reflex will be, can we have risk modeling done on previous facts? And there are not so many. So let me take you on that journey. Yes, no worries.
Oh, Amazon. Okay.
There we go. So every big splash starts with a first drop of water, right? And it's many tiny drops that collect, connect, and develop into two waves. Small waves, bigger waves, and eventually, hopefully, grow into that big splash that we definitely need for one of those great challenges we're faced with climate change, because that's what I'm focusing on. And I'll be sharing, as I said, the Road to Paris for ING, our journey to climate action. And the very first slide of this part of the conference was a lady standing on a summit. Well, we're definitely not standing on a summit yet, but we're charting unknown territory. So perhaps not climbing a mountain, but going out of doors and venturing in that unknown part is where we're at. And it took many tiny drops again, being my colleagues over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years, connecting, collecting, and reaching out to scientists, NGOs, what have you, to come to agreement on should there be a role for a bank in climate change. And we heard earlier today from Sustainable Finance Lab Rens van Tilburg in one of the breakout sessions, there was a time that we said, no, we're merely following the economy. It's not up to us, it's not our role to have even an opinion, a stance on something like climate change. And then, we grew into, of course, you should be banking responsibly, equator principles, that's an example of laying thresholds, connecting with other banks and saying there are certain no-go zones, and we will collectively guard those thresholds, if you will. Climate change was a new thing for us, and coming the Paris Climate Agreement, we are actually working on what should be our role and what would it look like in practice, and that, the droplets that connected came about in a first step, voicing our global commitment. So we pledged in September of last year at the San Francisco Global Climate Action Summit that we would align our full lending portfolio, and that's a book of 600 billion euros, with the well below 2 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. And that's not a hollow pledge, because we also said we will follow up with roadmaps, with targets per sector, so you can actually follow us in our journey. And since we're a bank, pure lending, that means we've got connections with our customers. It's not like investing in or out as a shareholder, but we lend to companies. We actually have the opportunity to engage with them and support them in their transition. As Jared earlier said today, that is what we fundamentally do. We may not initiate change, but we can at least accelerate or support the transition that our clients are embarking on. So where can we then start if this is the bold commitment, the big idea? We said, let's focus 80-20 rule on the most carbon intensive sectors. So this is generally known data. These are the sectors with the biggest carbon footprint, and ING is a pretty average bank in the sense that we're big in every of these sectors. We're heavily invested in oil and gas, in energy production. The symbols at the bottom depict the sectors: aviation, shipping, steel, cement, commercial real estate, and residential housing, so our mortgage portfolio. And to divvy it up a bit more, for our mortgage portfolio, which is roughly half of the 300 billion euros, we're looking at the energy efficiency of houses, and we set the ambition for a net energy positive mortgage portfolio. But I'd like to share with you what we are working on with the 2 Degrees Investing Initiative, which is a global think tank backed by the European Commission and supported by academics, CSOs alike. And we teamed up with them to look at that other part of our portfolio, so the sectors with the corporations I mentioned, the steel, the cement, the oil and gas, and what have you. Because we felt that, of course, ultimately the footprint of those sectors should go down. That's the ultimate aim, right? But would CO2 be the most meaningful metric to steer on? We were not so sure about, because we are not financing carbon emissions. We're financing assets. We're financing technology. We're financing newly built ships, oil rigs, power plants. So 2 Degrees Investing Initiative already worked with investors on a methodology they call PACTA. And this PACTA approach looks at the technology mix at technology roadmaps that institutions like the International Energy Agency publish. And that are the roadmaps really in the context of the world's economy that guide us to the goals of Paris. So our complete approach, we call the Terra approach. That's how we go about with getting to our ultimate goal. And this PACTA methodology is one of the tools we use. And perhaps this is a good moment to make a small sidestep to that other side of the coin, because this all sounds so smooth now, right? But there's loads of questions, dilemmas, difficulties. I won't even say challenges. There's just difficulties that we face. But we felt you just should go out there, reach out also to other companies, other banks, financial institutions, and get started. And that paid off. So what we did is internally, we already looked at the tools that we have implemented in place and are developing. So to give you an example, we've got a coal policy. This is an example of what we do not finance going forward. This was issued, by the way, before the Paris Climate Agreement, 2015. We're the first bank to announce such a phase out of coal, apart from, I must applaud the niche banks like Triodos that have that in their purpose. But we are a legacy bank, you could say. We have this in our book. So this actually means something. This means that from 2015 onwards, we had to start the conversation with clients who coal mines, coal-fired power plants, and what have you, telling them that we will not refinance, we will not finance any new projects. Imagine then that you're working in ING in the Polish office. Nearly every colleague there has family working in the coal industry. And really that is where their economy is driving on, right? The electricity is mainly generated with coal, but also there it's a global policy. We won't go there anymore. It's painful, quite painful for them. They were not happy. We had customers in the US, same sort of conversations, but also in other countries in Europe. Government officials speaking up say, what the hell are you guys doing? Stepping into the driver's seat, who are you to conclude before there's even legislation that you should step out of a certain sector? But, looking ahead, there is no future for thermal coal in energy production. So we also feel that from maybe a risk perspective, in the end, there will be a phase out, there will be legislation. So in that sense, it's also taking the step ahead and, choosing the way forward rather than staying in a sector for a very long time. And we feel if you announce that in an early stage, you can actually take your clients along for the ride. There is a transition path. Same goes for mortgages, by the way. If we start today with a bit of a gradual transition path, then it won't be such a painful process. This set aside. So also interesting maybe on the Polish ING colleagues. We were again in the spotlights with our bold commitment, right? I just showed the alignment of the portfolio, and we thought, how would they respond? Because it's basically putting the lens again at the coal policy and other types of measures we are going to take. But now extreme weather, and this is not a scientific fact, I just heard from the colleagues, actually really makes casualties in Poland, casualties ecologically, but also human. And there's century-old trees, for instance, in people's parents' acres or backyards are uprooted. And the colleagues there say, we still not really like it, but we see that we have to go there. So, that's also an interesting change happening because, unfortunately, the effects are becoming so much more clear. There is also an upside in the sense that if you are looking for the companies that want to make the transition, we looked into how can we reward those companies? How can we incentivize them to take a step on the transition road? And we developed what's called a sustainability improvement loans. There is now many varieties also with other banks. We're the first to issue one of those. And how it basically works, if a company performs well on sustainability on before set ESG KPIs, can be even a carbon target, then the higher they perform in sustainability, the lower the interest rate. So there is a financial incentive. This is not fully philanthropic, I must add, because we have found out as early as 2013-14 that actually ESG outperformers, corporations that are really strong in ESG, are the ones with a long-term strategy and are outperforming their peers. And we've tested that with our loan book. They have a lower default rate, so they pay back their loans well in time, even faster than others, and we're much more likely to get our money back, basically. So there's a win-win there. The third example I already mentioned, there's a side effect, there's the sustainable housing ambition to have a net energy positive mortgage portfolio. And this one I put in bold, you can't see it really well. But I thought, yeah, let's highlight this as well, because transparency, I won't say reporting necessarily, but showing your progress. So be clear about your targets, not only the bold ambition, but also the roadmaps and the targets, and report on it. Drives progress internally and externally, but it also makes you vulnerable. So this is one of the dilemmas, really, and also one that me and my colleagues have lots of talks about within the company. So how far do you dare to go? And is it only a matter of courage to be so open about how our lending book is or is not aligned with the 2-degree goal? So we will be publishing, as a world first, again, a progress report in September, since it's 1 year after we made our pledge. But it's scary, and we're heavily debating what should be in there, how we should put it. Will other banks do the same, or will it look very different from other banks? We will be publishing, and of course, behind the scene, and that is my last slide, we're not doing this alone. And as I mentioned, we were reaching out to expert academics, other banks before. We work closely together within the Dutch banking sector, international banking sector, but also we broadened our impact by sharing our ambition, the climate pledge, with 4 other European banks, combining our 600 billion lending book to, well, it's not a lot, but 2.4 trillion at least is more than what ING can bring in. And there is another 20 banks already in the pipeline also wanting to commit to this. We're looking into that, but to give you a bit of a insight to our next steps, maybe even a bigger complement, and we're seriously contemplating that, is to let go of this Katowice commitment as another platform. I mean, Katowice COP24 is also in the past, because the text of that commitment, based on our climate ambition, is actually adopted in the common climate goal that the Principles for Responsible Banking, which UNEP will be launching in New York in September, is contemplating as the concrete target for this area. And then, you know, it's out there. It's not only the 28 core banks of the drafting banks for the UNEP Principles for Responsible Banking, but hopefully all these banks signing up to the principles will benefit from the work that we with other banks already have done. It's all open source, it's all out there, and yeah, we're inviting, to steal another speaker's, Rens van Tilburg, golden nugget, the collaborative action or advocacy, to go out there and try and scale the impact that we can have as a single bank and have an amplifying effect, and hopefully, do our bit. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Great, so we'll spend a few moments in question and answer mode, and I certainly have some questions. Have a seat, yeah.
Yes.
But let's put it out to the audience first to see if you have any questions, and we'll get the, okay, another question over here, and okay, so we've got 2 lined up on this side and 1 over here, so we'll take this one first.
First of all, I want to say it's impressive what you do at ING to be like one of the frontiers, and it's amazing. I had a question because I talked also with an investment banker at UBS, and they said they now have a lot of money to invest in more sustainable projects. But is there actually is there enough projects who actually to really take all this money and really implement it in enough projects who actually make a decent return? Or do you also, for example, when me as an investment banker come to your bank and say I want to invest, I don't know, 5 million euros in more sustainable objects, do you also give me, so at the end of the year, give me a financial return report? Do you also give me an impact return report? That could be maybe interesting.
Yeah, very valid questions. I must say that we are not an investment bank, so we're looking at loans. That makes it a bit different. So to answer to your question, we see the challenge, or are there enough sustainable projects, for instance, when issuing a green bond? Then you have the labeling and looking into, everybody's jumping on the real green projects, right? And that is a risk in itself, we feel. So because we are a bank, we focus more on transitioning of the mainstream middle. So getting the companies that need to change, they all need to change on board, and perhaps looking into extending credit lines into, for instance, batteries or other fields that we feel, because of the technology mix needed, should be expanded. So yeah, maybe not a straight answer because we're not faced with that challenge, but that's how we approach it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I know we have one from Carol up high, and then since the mic is up there, we'll start with Carol, and then we'll go to Klaus a little bit lower down the line here. So Carol.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to hear that you're putting your money where your mouth is, and it's very nice that you're effectively financing companies interested in change. A number of businesses will not be so aggressively pursuing change, and effectively you're pushing them to other parts of the banking system that are perhaps less principled. Have you had any internal discussions how you deal with that dilemma? Because in a way, while you and your friends are doing a lot better, you're only touching a small part of the system potentially. You might be just pushing whole industries to banks that are prepared to continue in the old way.
So I get what you're aiming at, but this is in essence a very inclusive approach. So the coal policy being the exemption at the moment, but at the moment we're not looking at more exclusions, but taking the clients along for the ride. But there in the future there could be scenarios, of course, of customers do not want to change. Basically, that would be the same with our environmental social risk framework now, right? If you do the due diligence on a client and you find that there's human rights violations or the potential for that in the supply chain or at the clients, you might want to engage in plans how to make that better. But if the client doesn't deliver in the end, there is an exit, but that's farther away. So where we're at is that all the sector heads are making their plans with targets and in between timelines, KPIs, what have you, and that will be very much inclusive. Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's go to Klaus up here.
First of all, thank you again, really, thank you for taking legitimate action, not only legal action. So by being even in front of your customers and showing the direction, I think this is just wonderful. So really, thank you for that. Second, thank you as a side note also for hosting the transformation journey in Amsterdam. That was great as well. My question to you is, may I assume that the business is not suffering because there is enough need for, let's say, sustainable loans, and that you're shifting the volume of your business towards the right direction? And if not so, if there is internal discussion, how do you deal with that part of the whole story? Thank you.
Okay, and there's another question right near there, so if
we
it's okay
them?
with you
Yeah,
to take
sure.
two? Yeah,
It
great,
goes
thanks.
a
And
little
we'll
bit
cap
nearly
it
in
there.
the equal direction. The hardest point always is explaining customers what are the options, what are the possibilities. So how much are you using your best practices, however they call this? Okay, this company did this and that and this and reached this and this goals. So how much are you preparing material for supporting others and showing them, look, these are the options, this is where you're missing your goals, this is where you have opportunities for improvements. and things like this? How much are you sharing information like this to other customers or maybe even to the community?
Yeah. Well, maybe to start with the last question and then tag into, is this harming our business, yes or no? So actually the PACTA approach allows us to tap into global asset databases and see whether our clients on an individual client level are aligned with the 2 degrees pathway, for instance, that IEA technology roadmap. So this is what we can offer to our clients. It's insights, data that we have access to. Other banks can have as well. I mean, it's not protected, but you have to be connected to 2 degrees investing initiative. And they can benefit from that. So indeed, we can suggest or talk about, benchmarks or examples in the sector. But we're also a bit cautious because usually our clients know better about their business, right? So we ask them about the sector targets they're discussing with their peers and how they're working together and what have you. And then there's, of course, what we can offer in round tables. So we quite often are a connecting platform, as financial institutions can do, to connect startups and scale-ups with invested corporates and what have you. Even other financial institutions, since we're not a big investor and certainly not an angel investor with high risk capital, we're happy to do blended finance solutions or have other financiers taking up those challenges since we're in lending. So this is how we go about. And would it then harm our business? Well, I would certainly say it's not painless. And we did a lot of calculations before we made the announcement. So how far would it impact our portfolio? And we could see that it would affect certain business lines, and it will, as with coal customers, for instance. We can still have the conversations, and some of them are more engaged or happier than others. But we feel that other opportunities open up. The whole of the economy needs to shift in a certain direction. So it's an ongoing dialogue with no straight answer. But let me put it this way: it's not painless, but we can take the burden, the impact, and shareholders are satisfied at the moment with how we manage it and our profit in the end.
Okay. I'm going to take the facilitator's prerogative of asking one final question.
Of course.
So I'm a co-founder or an instigator and a technical advisory group member on the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is the global initiative that sets the thresholds and sort of validates the methodologies for applying science-based targets at companies. And so one of the things that's been going on there is that there's a sector-based approach that relies on sector-based scenarios. And the IEA is the body that produces those, and they're all stuck at a 2-degree threshold right now. So the IEA has not actually translated since the IPCC report, and this is a long process. So I know that you've sort of weighed in on that in a very specific way in response to some engagement. So I wonder, I find it a very interesting way of taking something that could have been combative and transforming it into something that's really a positive response. So if you could tell the OECD.
Sure. This started in 2017. 4 NGOs, being Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, the Netherlands, Banktrack, and Oxfam, actually filed a case with our Dutch national contact point for the OECD guidelines. So they filed a complaint against ING, saying, you're the biggest bank in the Netherlands and you're not taking enough action on climate change. And we feel you're actually in violation here with the OECD guidelines. Well, I must say our first approach was, what? We're working really hard at it. It's true, it's still behind the scenes. Come and look at it. But the dialogue started, and the contact point said, well, we actually find merit in this case, so we want to be the mediator and put you guys at the table. And that, took over a year, and we just concluded this dialogue, I think, 2 months ago, something, Fast forward, so by being in a dialogue, we were already in contact, but this intensified things, of course, also having a mediator at the table. We could share what we're working on, the Terra approach, even before we launched it. But also one of the questions of the NGOs was, okay, you should actually not align with a well below 2 degree, preferably 1.5 degree Paris goal, but you should push for 1.5 degrees. And at first we said, the risky banker's defense approach. Yeah, but that's really hard because there's no roadmaps and the IEA has got this 2 degrees. And factually that's true, and we actually said, dear Greenpeace, dear Backtrack, if you have roadmaps, bring them about. But in the end, it's not about facts and data here. It's about, are you doing the right thing and are you really putting your weight in? And then we tried to be a bit more creative, and we thought, well, we alone cannot change the world, but what we could do is team up with the NGOs. We invited them and said, well, maybe we together can go to the IEA and ask them to update scenarios and come with a 1.5 degree scenario. And actually, we're in the midst of planning that meeting, and also the Dutch government will be part of that, because also our finance minister said recently in answers to questions from Parliament, I think the current scenario is good, right, or not? So, and then we said, nah, maybe you should be part of this conversation, because it's a bit awkward if our Dutch government says, no, stay where you are, and NGOs say, please move ahead. And we said, we want to be part of the positive change, but well, we'd preferably have bodies like the IEA come up with the roadmaps, because we're not apt to do so. So that's the example, yeah.
That's great, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. Thank you for this presentation, and thank you so much
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah,
Yeah,
take
thank
care.
you. Yeah.